I never thought my own sister would drag me to court over our late father's will. But there I sat watching Vivian's lawyer demand my entire inheritance be transferred to her. She claimed I was unfit to handle Dad's assets, citing my modest teaching salary as proof. The judge seemed convinced by her polished presentation and expensive legal team. Just as I thought I'd lost everything our father worked for, the courtroom doors opened. A man in an impeccable black suit walked in carrying a briefcase that would change everything. What he revealed next didn't just shock the room, it exposed a family secret that had been buried for 20 years. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, justice, and family secrets, I want to know, where are you watching from today? If you're ready to see how karma finally caught up with my sister, smash that like button and subscribe for more family drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe what that mysterious man revealed next. My name is Seraphina, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had the perfect relationship with my older sister, Vivian. We grew up in a wealthy Connecticut suburb where Dad built his fortune from a small accounting firm into a multi-million-dollar financial consulting empire. Vivian always seemed destined for success. Harvard MBA corner office at a prestigious investment firm, married to a hedge fund manager. Meanwhile, I chose teaching elementary school, finding joy in shaping young minds rather than chasing money. When Dad passed from a sudden heart attack last year, the grief hit us both hard. He'd always been our anchor, the one who kept our family grounded despite our wealth. The reading of his will seemed straightforward initially. He left his business and primary assets to both of us equally. But there was one specific provision that puzzled everyone. A sealed envelope marked, "For Seraphina only," to be opened after my death. Inside that envelope was a key to a safety deposit box I never knew existed, along with a note written in Dad's careful handwriting. Sarah, if something happens to me unexpectedly, the truth about our family's fortune lies in box 357 at First National. Trust no one with this information until you've seen everything inside. Your loving father. The next morning, I drove to the bank with trembling hands. What I found in that safety deposit box shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. There were documents dating back 25 years, financial records showing mysterious transfers, and most shocking of all, evidence that Dad's business partner, Marcus Rothwell, had been systematically embezzling money from their firm. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding bank statements showing that Vivian had been receiving monthly payments of $50,000 from Marcus Rothwell for the past 3 years. The payments were labeled as consulting fees, but the dates corresponded perfectly with when Dad had started questioning discrepancies in the company's accounts. My hands shook as I photographed every document. There were emails between Vivian and Marcus discussing keeping the old man quiet and managing the transition. One email from Vivian made my blood run cold. "Dad's getting too suspicious. We need to accelerate our timeline. Once he's gone, Seraphina will be easy to handle. She's too naive to understand the business anyway." I sat in that sterile bank vault for over an hour, processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My sister hadn't just been stealing from Dad's company, she'd been planning something much larger. The documents revealed a complex scheme to transfer all of Dad's assets to a shell company that Marcus controlled, with Vivian as the primary beneficiary. But there was one document that confused me, a contract with someone listed only as J. Morrison, legal consultant. The contract was dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death and included the cryptic phrase, "Asset Protection Services in anticipation of family disputes." When I finally left the bank, my phone was buzzing with messages from Vivian. "Sarah, we need to talk about Dad's will. There are some irregularities that need to be addressed. My lawyer wants to meet with us tomorrow." I knew then that she was making her move. Whatever she and Marcus had planned, they were putting it into motion now that Dad was gone and couldn't protect me anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad's warning to trust no one, but I also realized that he must have known what was coming. The question was, who was Jay Morrison, and what kind of protection had Dad arranged for me? The answer would come sooner than I expected, but first I had to endure 3 months of Vivian's psychological warfare. She started with subtle manipulation, suggesting I was too emotional to handle Dad's business affairs. Then came the financial pressure. Somehow, my teaching salary was delayed, my credit cards were mysteriously canceled, and my apartment lease was lost by the management company. When subtle tactics failed, Vivian escalated to legal action. Her lawsuit claimed that Dad had been suffering from early-stage dementia when he wrote his will, making it invalid. She presented medical records I'd never seen before, supposedly documenting Dad's cognitive decline. Her lawyers painted me as a manipulative daughter who had taken advantage of a sick old man. The most painful part wasn't the legal battle, it was watching my sister lie so effortlessly about our father. She stood in that courthouse and claimed Dad had been confused and paranoid in his final months, describing him as a shadow of his former self. I knew it was all fabricated, but she was so convincing that even I started doubting my own memories. The courtroom felt ice cold that Tuesday morning as Vivian's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Peterson, presented what seemed like an airtight case. He had medical experts testifying about Dad's alleged mental decline, financial advisors claiming I lacked the competency to manage substantial assets, and character witnesses painting me as an irresponsible dreamer who'd never held a real job. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table looking every inch the successful businesswoman, Armani suit, perfectly styled hair, and air of confidence that suggested she'd already won. Occasionally, she'd glance my way with what looked like pity, as if she genuinely believed she was saving me from myself. My court-appointed lawyer, fresh out of law school, and clearly overwhelmed by the opposition's resources, fumbled through cross-examinations and seemed to accept defeat before the battle had even begun. I watched helplessly as Peterson systematically dismantled my father's legacy, painting him as a confused old man who'd been manipulated by his younger daughter. "Your Honor," Peterson argued, "the evidence clearly shows that Ms. Seraphina took advantage of her father's declining mental state to influence his estate planning. The defendant isolated him from his older daughter, filled his head with paranoid delusions about his business partner, and convinced him to alter his will in her favor. This is a textbook case of elder abuse." The words hit me like physical blows. Elder abuse, manipulation, paranoid delusions. Every lie felt like a betrayal not just of me, but of Dad's memory. Then Peterson played his trump card, a recording that supposedly captured Dad expressing doubts about my character. The voice sounded like Dad, but something was wrong. The cadence was off, the phrasing unnatural, like someone reading from a script. "I worry about Seraphina." The recording played. "She's always been this dreamer, never understood business. Maybe Vivian should handle everything after I'm gone. She's got the experience, the connections. I might have made a mistake with the will." My heart shattered as those words filled the courtroom. Even though I suspected it was fabricated, hearing what sounded like Dad's voice expressing doubt about me was devastating. Several jurors nodded sympathetically, and I could see my case crumbling in real time. Vivian actually managed to produce tears as the recording played, dabbing her eyes with a tissue while maintaining perfect composure. She was giving the performance of her life, and everyone was buying it. Judge Harrison, an elderly man with kind eyes who reminded me of Dad, looked genuinely conflicted. "Ms. Seraphina, do you have any evidence to refute these claims about your father's mental state, or any documentation to support your contention that the will reflects his true wishes?" My lawyer started to stand, probably to deliver some inadequate response about circumstantial evidence, when the courtroom doors opened with a soft but distinct sound. A man in an impeccable black suit entered his presence, immediately commanding attention. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. In his hand was a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than my annual salary. The man walked directly to the judge's bench, completely ignoring the court's protocol. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. I am James Morrison, representing the estate of the late Robert Blackwood in a matter directly relevant to these proceedings." Vivian's face went white. Peterson jumped to his feet, objecting, but the judge held up his hand. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Harrison said clearly, recognizing the name, "this is highly irregular. What is the nature of your business here?" Morrison opened his briefcase with deliberate precision. "Your Honor, I have in my possession documents that were prepared by Mr. Blackwood in anticipation of exactly this type of family dispute. These documents include audio and video recordings made by Mr. Blackwood himself, financial records documenting fraudulent activity by the plaintiff, and sworn affidavits from witnesses who can testify to Mr. Blackwood's mental acuity right up until the day he died." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Vivian grabbed Peterson's arm, whispering frantically, but her lawyer looked as stunned as everyone else. Morrison continued, "Mr. Blackwood retained my services because he suspected that certain family members and business associates were planning to challenge his estate after his death. He specifically requested that these materials only be presented if someone attempted to question his mental competency or manipulate his assets posthumously." He pulled out a tablet and set it on the judge's bench. This video was recorded by Mr. Blackwood just 48 hours before his death. I believe it will clarify any questions about his mental state. Dad's face appeared on the screen, sitting in his study at home. He looked tired but completely lucid, his eyes sharp and focused. "If this video is being played, it means someone is trying to steal my daughter's inheritance." Dad's voice filled the courtroom, strong and clear. "I want to state for the record that I am of sound mind and body. I understand exactly what I'm doing with my will, and I'm making these arrangements because I have evidence that my elder daughter Vivian and my business partner Marcus Rothwell have been embezzling money from my company." Vivian stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. "This is fabricated. That video is fake." Morrison smiled coldly. "Mrs. Ashworth, I have here the original digital file with metadata, the testimony of the video technician who assisted Mr. Blackwood with the recording, and financial records that corroborate every claim your father is about to make." On screen, Dad continued, "I've been investigating irregularities in my company's accounts for months. What I discovered broke my heart. Vivian has been working with Marcus to systematically steal from the business we built together. They've been planning to take everything after my death, leaving Seraphina with nothing." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate. The jurors who had been sympathetic to Vivian now stared at her with horror. Peterson was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly unprepared for this development. But Dad wasn't finished. "I'm recording this because I know they'll try to claim I was mentally incompetent. They'll probably forge medical records, create fake recordings of my voice, and do whatever it takes to steal Seraphina's birthright. That's why I've hired James Morrison to protect her when I can't anymore." Morrison turned to face Vivian, his expression hard as granite. "Mrs. Ashworth, I also have recordings of your conversations with Marcus Rothwell discussing your plans to defraud your sister, copies of the forged medical records you submitted to this court, and evidence that the audio recording played earlier was created using voice synthesis technology." The judge leaned forward, his kind demeanor replaced by stern authority. "Mr. Peterson, I suggest you advise your client that she may want to consider requesting a recess to consult with criminal counsel." The recess that followed was chaos. Vivian's perfectly composed facade crumbled as she huddled with Peterson in the hallway, their heated whispers echoing off the marble walls. I caught fragments, never mentioned Morrison. How could we have known? And most tellingly, we need to contact Marcus immediately. Meanwhile, James Morrison approached me with the same calm efficiency he'd displayed in the courtroom. Up close, he was even more impressive, silver hair, perfectly styled, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and an air of quiet authority that suggested he'd won battles far more complex than this family dispute. "Ms. Seraphina," he said, extending his hand. "Your father spoke of you often during our meetings. He was very proud of the woman you'd become and very worried about what might happen to you after his death." "You knew about all of this," I said, still processing everything that had just happened. "Dad knew Vivian was going to do this." Morrison nodded grimly. Your father was an exceptionally intelligent man who built his fortune by anticipating problems before they arose. When he first contacted me 8 months ago, he'd already uncovered most of the embezzlement scheme. What he needed was legal protection for you and a way to ensure the truth would come out if something happened to him. He opened his briefcase again, revealing meticulously organized files. Your father didn't just leave you that safety deposit box key. As evidence, he created an entire legal strategy. Every document in there was part of a larger plan to expose Vivian and Marcus while protecting you from exactly the kind of attack we just witnessed. As Morrison explained Dad's preparations, I realized the scope of what my father had discovered was even larger than I'd imagined. The embezzlement scheme had been running for nearly 5 years, with Vivian gradually increasing the amounts she stole as she gained access to more company accounts. Marcus had been the mastermind, using his position as Dad's business partner to manipulate the books, while Vivian provided inside information about Dad's plans and concerns. The monthly payments to Vivian weren't just consultation fees, Morrison explained. They were her cut of the stolen money. But more than that, they were payment for intelligence. Every time your father expressed suspicion about the company's finances, Vivian reported back to Marcus. When your father started talking about bringing in an independent auditor, they knew they had to act fast. The implications hit me like a physical blow. "They killed him," I whispered. Morrison's expression darkened. "We can't prove that yet, but your father certainly suspected they might try something drastic. That's why he arranged for the video recordings, and why he insisted on multiple safeguards to protect you." He showed me a thick folder labeled Alliance Documentation. Your father identified several key people who could help us build an airtight case. Some are former employees who witnessed suspicious activities. Others are business associates who Marcus tried to recruit for other schemes. And a few are family friends who noticed changes in Vivian's behavior over the past few years. The first ally Morrison had contacted was Margaret Sullivan, Dad's longtime secretary, who had been forced into early retirement 6 months before Dad's death. Margaret had kept copies of all the financial documents that Marcus had ordered destroyed, knowing something wasn't right about the request. Margaret was suspicious when Marcus suddenly insisted that certain records needed to be archived in a storage facility that only he had access to, Morrison explained. She made copies of everything before turning over the originals. Those copies include emails between Marcus and offshore account managers' wire transfer receipts, and most importantly, recorded phone conversations. The next ally was David Park, a former business partner whom Marcus had approached about joining a new venture that sounded suspiciously like money laundering. David had secretly recorded their meetings, thinking he might need evidence if Marcus tried to implicate him in anything illegal. David has recordings of Marcus bragging about how easy it was to manipulate your father, and how Vivian was worth every penny for the inside information she provided, Morrison said. He also recorded Marcus discussing plans to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. But the most important ally was someone I never expected: Thomas Ashworth, Vivian's own husband. Morrison pulled out a sealed envelope marked Confidential T. Ashworth. "Your brother-in-law contacted me 3 weeks ago," Morrison said quietly. He'd been suspicious of Vivian's sudden increase in spending and her secretive phone calls. When he hired a private investigator to follow her, he discovered her meetings with Marcus and overheard conversations about getting rid of the old man and dealing with the sister problem. My heart raced as Morrison explained that Thomas had been secretly documenting Vivian's activities for months. He'd photographed her entering Marcus's office building at odd hours, recorded her phone conversations when she thought he was asleep, and even found a second cell phone she used exclusively for communication with Marcus. "Thomas is terrified of his wife," Morrison admitted. "But he's also a decent man who couldn't stand by while she destroyed her family. He's agreed to testify about everything he witnessed, but he's requested protection because he believes Vivian might become dangerous if she realizes he's betrayed her." Batayet. The evidence was overwhelming, but Morrison warned me that Vivian and Marcus wouldn't give up easily. They've stolen millions of dollars and committed multiple felonies. When they realize they're facing serious prison time, they'll become desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things. As if summoned by his words, Peterson appeared at my elbow. His earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. Ms. Seraphina, my client, would like to discuss a settlement. Perhaps we can resolve this matter without further embarrassment to the family. Morrison's laugh was cold as winter. Mr. Peterson, your client is facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The only settlement she should be discussing is with the district attorney. Peterson's face flushed red. Now see here, Morrison. My client made some mistakes, but this is a family matter. Surely we can reach some arrangement that benefits everyone. Your client stole from her dying father and tried to frame her sister for elder abuse, Morrison replied evenly. The only arrangement she'll be making is with her cellmate. As Peterson scurried back to deliver the bad news, Morrison turned to me with something approaching warmth. Your father was right about you, Seraphina. You have his strength and his integrity. But this battle isn't over yet. Vivian and Marcus have had years to prepare for this moment, and they won't surrender without a fight. He was more right than either of us realized. As we prepared to return to the courtroom, neither of us noticed the figure watching from across the hallway. Marcus Rothwell himself, his face a mask of cold calculation as he spoke quietly into his phone. The real war was just beginning, and Vivian had one more card to play that none of us saw coming. When court resumed, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Judge Harrison had clearly used the recess to review Morrison's evidence, and his expression suggested he was not pleased with what he'd discovered. Vivian sat rigidly beside Peterson, her earlier tears replaced by a mask of cold fury that reminded me uncomfortably of our mother during her worst moments. Morrison began presenting his evidence methodically, starting with the financial records that proved the embezzlement. Each document he displayed on the courtroom's screen showed another layer of the conspiracy: falsified invoices, unauthorized wire transfers, and doctored account statements that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning years. Your Honor, Morrison said, pulling up a series of bank statements. These records show that over $4.7 million were stolen from Robert Blackwood's company accounts between 2019 and 2024. The money was transferred through a complex network of shell companies, ultimately ending up in accounts controlled by Marcus Rothwell and Vivian Ashworth. Peterson objected repeatedly, but each time Morrison produced additional documentation that supported his claims. The evidence was so comprehensive that even Peterson seemed to realize his client's position was hopeless. Then Morrison called his first witness, Margaret Sullivan Dad's former secretary. Margaret was in her 70s with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen everything in her decades of working with Dad. Mrs. Sullivan, Morrison began, can you describe what happened in the months before your retirement? Margaret's voice was clear and strong as she testified. Mr. Blackwood had become very concerned about discrepancies in the company's financial reports. He asked me to help him investigate, and what we found was disturbing. She went on to describe how Marcus had pressured her to retire early, offering a generous severance package in exchange for her immediate departure, and a promise not to discuss company business with anyone. I knew something was wrong, Margaret continued. Mr. Blackwood was like family to me after 30 years of working together. When Marcus tried to buy my silence, I made copies of everything I thought might be important. I'm glad I did. Morrison then presented Margaret's copied documents, which included emails between Marcus and various shell companies' records of the unauthorized transfers, and most damning of all, recorded phone conversations between Marcus and Vivian discussing their plans. In this recording from March 15, 2024, Morrison announced, "We can hear Mrs. Ashworth and Mr. Rothwell discussing how to handle Mr. Blackwood's growing suspicions." Vivian's voice filled the courtroom, cold and calculating. "Daddy's getting too close to the truth. We need to accelerate our timeline. How much more do we need before we can make this look like natural business losses?" Marcus's response chilled the room. "Another 6 months of transfers should do it. But if your father keeps digging, we might need to consider more direct action. Accidents happen to elderly men under stress. The jury's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several members looked at Vivian with obvious disgust, while others appeared genuinely shocked by what they were hearing. But Vivian wasn't finished. As Morrison prepared to call his next witness, she suddenly stood up, her composed mask finally slipping completely. "This is all fabricated," she screamed. That recording is fake, Seraphina, and this Morrison character have conspired to frame me. They're trying to steal my inheritance." Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Mrs. Ashworth, you will remain seated and allow your attorney to speak for you." But Vivian was beyond reason. "You don't understand. Seraphina has always been jealous of me. She's the one who manipulated Daddy. She convinced him I was stealing from him because she wanted everything for herself." Peterson was frantically trying to control his client, but Vivian shoved him away. "I built that company as much as Daddy did. I deserved that money. Seraphina never worked a day in the business, never contributed anything, and now she wants to destroy me." "Your Honor," Morrison said calmly, "I believe Mrs. Ashworth's outburst demonstrates exactly the kind of entitled thinking that led to this situation in the first place." Just then, the courtroom doors opened again. This time, it was Thomas Ashworth, Vivian's husband, looking pale and determined. He walked directly to Morrison, whispered something in his ear, and then took a seat in the gallery. Morrison's expression darkened as he listened to Thomas's whispered words. He excused himself for a moment, walked to where Thomas was sitting, and engaged in a brief but intense conversation. When he returned to the front of the courtroom, his demeanor had changed completely. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I've just received information that requires immediate attention. It appears that Mrs. Ashworth and Mr. Rothwell have been attempting to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence even as this trial proceeds." He turned to face Vivian directly. "Mrs. Ashworth, were you aware that your husband has been recording your phone conversations for the past 3 months?" The color drained from Vivian's face. She looked at Thomas with an expression of pure betrayal, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Morrison continued relentlessly. "Mr. Ashworth has informed me that you called Marcus Rothwell during our recess and instructed him to eliminate the Sullivan problem, and to make sure David Park understands the consequences of betraying the family. Would you care to explain what those instructions meant?" Peterson was on his feet immediately. "Objection. This is hearsay and prejudicial." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said, but his expression suggested he was very interested in hearing more. Morrison nodded. "Your Honor, I have here a recording made by Mr. Thomas Ashworth of his wife's phone conversation with Marcus Rothwell just 45 minutes ago. I believe it will clarify the nature of these instructions." Before Peterson could object again, Morrison played the recording. Vivian's voice was crystal clear, filled with panic and rage. "Marcus, we're finished if these people testify. You need to handle Margaret and David before they can say anything else. I don't care what it takes. And find out everything you can about this Morrison character. There has to be something we can use against him." Marcus's response was equally chilling. "Don't worry about Morrison. I've got people looking into his background already. As for Margaret and David, accidents happen. Old people have heart attacks, and former business associates sometimes have car trouble." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Peterson looked stunned by what his client had just been caught planning. But the worst revelation came in Thomas's next whispered update to Morrison. Apparently, Marcus had been more efficient than anyone expected. Margaret Sullivan had been found unconscious in her home just 2 hours earlier, the victim of what appeared to be a break-in gone wrong. She was alive but hospitalized in critical condition. When Morrison announced this development to the court, the transformation in the room was immediate. This was no longer just about inheritance fraud. It had become attempted murder. Judge Harrison called an immediate recess and instructed the bailiff to take Vivian into custody. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she turned to me with a look of such pure hatred that it made my blood run cold. "This isn't over, Seraphina," she hissed. You have no idea what you've started." But even as they led her away, I realized that Morrison looked worried rather than triumphant. Thomas's betrayal had given us the evidence we needed, but it had also revealed that Marcus was still free and apparently willing to kill to protect himself. The battle was far from over, and now the stakes had become deadly. The 24 hours following Vivienne's arrest were a whirlwind of police investigations, media attention, and revelations that kept getting more shocking. Morrison had arranged for protective custody for both Thomas and me, housing us in a secure hotel suite, while the authorities tracked down Marcus Rothwell, who had seemingly vanished after Margaret's attack. Margaret Sullivan survived her injuries, but barely. The doctors said she'd been struck on the head with a blunt object during what was made to look like a home invasion. The only thing that saved her life was her neighbor's dog, whose barking had scared off the attacker before he could finish the job. "Margaret's conscious and asking to speak with you," Morrison told me as we sat in the hotel suite's living room. Thomas was pacing by the windows, looking haggard and frightened since learning that his wife was not only a thief, but potentially a killer. "Is it safe?" I asked. The past day had taught me that nowhere felt truly secure anymore. Morrison nodded. "The hospital has police protection, and Marcus hasn't been spotted since yesterday. Besides, what Margaret has to tell you might be the final piece we need to ensure Vivienne and Marcus never hurt anyone again." At the hospital, Margaret looked frail but determined. Her head was bandaged and her left arm was in a sling, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Seraphina, dear," she said weakly, "I'm so sorry this has all happened to you. Your father would be heartbroken to see what his own daughter became." She reached under her pillow with her good hand and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Before that monster attacked me, I managed to save one more piece of evidence. I've been carrying this with me everywhere since your father died, knowing that someday someone would need to hear what's on it." My hands shook as she placed the recorder in my palm. "What is it?" "The last conversation your father ever had with Vivienne," Margaret said quietly. "He called her to his office the day before he died. He'd finally gathered enough evidence to confront her about the embezzlement. I recorded it because I was afraid of what might happen." Morrison leaned forward intently. "Margaret, are you certain about the timing?" "This was the day before Robert died." "I'm positive. It was a Thursday afternoon around 3 o'clock. Mr. Blackwood had asked me to record all his meetings that day because he said he expected trouble. He was right." With trembling fingers, I pressed play. Dad's voice filled the room, stern but still loving. "Vivienne, I know what you've been doing. I know about the money you've been stealing, about your partnership with Marcus, about everything. I'm giving you one chance to come clean and make this right." Vivienne's response was cold and defiant. "I don't know what you're talking about, Daddy. Are you feeling all right? You've been so confused lately." "I'm not confused and I'm not senile," Dad replied firmly. "I have bank records, Vivienne. I have recordings of your conversations with Marcus. I know you've stolen nearly $5 million from the company we built together." There was a long pause before Vivienne spoke again, and when she did, her voice had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of innocence or concern. "So what if I took some money? I earned it. I've been covering for your mistakes for years, cleaning up your messes, making sure the company stayed profitable while you played the benevolent patriarch. You owe me that money." "I owe you nothing," Dad said quietly. "You're my daughter, and I love you, but I won't let you destroy everything I've worked to build. I'm giving you 48 hours to return the money and end your partnership with Marcus. If you don't, I'm going to the police." Vivienne's laugh was bitter and cruel. "You're not going anywhere, old man. You're going to keep your mouth shut and you're going to sign over control of the company to me, or I'll make sure everyone knows about your heart condition and how the stress of running a business has been too much for you." "What heart condition?" Dad asked, confusion clear in his voice. "The one you're about to develop," Vivienne said. "Stress-induced cardiac episodes run in our family, don't they? Mother had them all the time when she was upset. It would be such a tragedy if something similar happened to you." The recording ended there, but the implication was crystal clear. Vivian hadn't just threatened Dad, she'd essentially confessed to planning his murder. Morrison was already on his phone calling the district attorney's office. This recording, combined with everything else we'd uncovered, would be enough to charge Vivian with first-degree murder, not just embezzlement and fraud. But Margaret wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said weakly. "Something I should have told you earlier, but I wasn't sure how important it was." She explained that on the morning Dad died, she'd seen Marcus leaving the office building at an unusual time around 6 in the morning, hours before the office normally opened. He'd been carrying a small black bag and had seemed surprised and alarmed to see her arriving early to prepare for an important client meeting. I asked him what he was doing there so early, and he said he'd forgotten some important documents the night before. But he looked nervous, and when I went to Mr. Blackwood's office later, I noticed that his coffee maker had been moved. Your father was very particular about how things were arranged in his office. Everything always had to be in exactly the same place. Morrison's expression grew grim. "Margaret, did you mention this to anyone else?" "Just one person," she said. "I called Dr. Elizabeth Torres, the coroner who examined Mr. Blackwood's body. I told her about seeing Marcus and asked if she'd found anything unusual. She said she'd been meaning to call me back about that." 20 minutes later, Dr. Torres arrived at the hospital, a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes. She looked troubled as Morrison explained the situation and played the recording of Vivian's threats. "I've been bothered by something ever since I completed Robert Blackwood's autopsy," Dr. Torres said. "His death was ruled a heart attack, which wasn't unusual for a man his age under stress. But there were some inconsistencies that didn't quite make sense." She pulled out her tablet and showed us the autopsy photos. Mr. Blackwood's cardiac event was massive and sudden, which is consistent with acute stress or shock. But his blood work showed trace amounts of a compound I couldn't initially identify. I sent samples to a specialized lab for further analysis. Morrison leaned forward. "What kind of compound?" "The results came back yesterday," Dr. Torres continued. "It was a synthetic cardiac stimulant similar to those used in laboratory research. In small doses, it's relatively harmless. But in larger concentrations, especially when combined with caffeine, it can trigger massive heart failure in someone with even minor cardiac vulnerabilities." My hands flew to my mouth as the implications hit me. "They poisoned him." Dr. Torres nodded gravely. "The compound would have been tasteless and odorless when mixed into coffee. Given what Margaret observed about the moved coffee maker and Marcus's unusual early morning presence, I believe we're looking at a carefully planned murder." Morrison was already coordinating with the police to issue additional warrants. The evidence against Vivian and Marcus was now overwhelming: premeditated murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, witness, intimidation, and attempted murder of Margaret Sullivan. But just as we seemed to have everything wrapped up, Morrison's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read it. "Marcus Rothwell has just been arrested," he announced. "But not by our people. He was picked up by federal agents at the Canadian border. Apparently, the FBI has been investigating him for an entirely different set of crimes: money laundering for organized crime figures." The scope of what we'd uncovered suddenly became much larger. Marcus hadn't just been embezzling from Dad's company, he'd been using it as part of a massive criminal enterprise. And Vivian, whether she knew it or not, had become an accessory to federal crimes that could put her away for life. As we prepared to return to court for Vivian's arraignment on murder charges, I realized that Dad's final gift to me hadn't just been protection from my sister's greed, it had been the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond our family. The truth was finally coming out, and justice was about to be served. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras, as Morrison, Thomas, and I arrived for what would be the final day of proceedings. Word had leaked about the murder charges against Vivian, and the federal investigation into Marcus, turning our family dispute into a major news story. Headlines screamed about the inheritance murder plot and sister's deadly greed. Inside the courtroom, Vivian looked nothing like the polished businesswoman who had tried to steal my inheritance just a week earlier. Her hair was disheveled, her orange jumpsuit wrinkled, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone who finally understood that her carefully constructed world was crashing down around her. Judge Harrison had been replaced by Judge Patricia Martinez, for the criminal proceedings a no-nonsense woman known for her tough sentences in white-collar crime cases. She reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. Mrs. Ashworth, Judge Martinez said, "You are charged with first-degree murder in the death of your father, Robert Blackwood, conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, fraud, witness intimidation, and accessory to federal money laundering crimes. How do you plead?" Vivian's new lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Kim, who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the case, whispered urgently in her client's ear. But Vivian shook her head violently. "Not guilty," she screamed, standing up so abruptly that the bailiff stepped forward. "This is all lies. Seraphina has turned everyone against me. I never hurt Daddy. I would never hurt him." But the evidence was overwhelming. Morrison methodically presented the recordings, the financial documents, Margaret's testimony about Marcus's suspicious behavior, and most damning of all, Dr. Torres's forensic evidence proving that Dad had been poisoned. The final blow came when Thomas took the stand to testify against his own wife. His voice shook as he described the recordings he'd made of Vivian's conversations with Marcus. Her callous discussions about eliminating problems, and her complete lack of remorse for what she'd done. "The woman I married doesn't exist anymore," Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "Maybe she never existed. I keep thinking about all the times she came home late from business meetings with Marcus, all the expensive purchases she made with money I thought came from her job, all the lies she told so effortlessly. I should have known sooner what she was capable of." When the prosecution rested, Vivian's lawyer made a half-hearted attempt to claim that her client had been manipulated by Marcus, that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. But the recordings of Vivian's own words made it impossible to deny her active participation in the conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. As the verdict was read, Vivian finally broke down completely, sobbing and screaming that it wasn't fair, that she'd worked harder than anyone else, that she deserved the money more than I did. Judge Martinez was unmoved by the display. "Mrs. Ashworth, you have been found guilty of murdering your father for financial gain, one of the most heinous crimes I have encountered in 25 years on the bench. You betrayed not only your family's trust, but the most fundamental bonds of human decency." The sentence was harsh, but fitting: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, with additional consecutive sentences for the other crimes. Marcus Rothwell, who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a plea deal, received 25 years in federal prison. As the court officers led Vivian away, she turned to look at me one last time. The hatred in her eyes had been replaced by something that looked almost like bewilderment, as if she genuinely couldn't understand how stealing millions of dollars and murdering her father could be considered wrong. "I loved him too," she whispered, and for just a moment I saw a glimpse of the sister I thought I knew. But then she was gone, disappearing into a future of orange jumpsuits and prison cells. Outside the courthouse, Morrison gathered Thomas and me for what he called a final accounting. Not only had we recovered all the money Vivian and Marcus had stolen, but the federal investigation had uncovered additional assets hidden in offshore accounts, after legal fees and restitution to other victims of Marcus's schemes. Dad's estate was worth even more than we'd originally thought. But more importantly, we'd uncovered the truth about Dad's death and ensured that his killers would never hurt anyone else. Thomas decided to start over in another state, taking his portion of the restitution money and trying to build a new life away from the wreckage of his marriage. Before he left, he gave me a letter he'd found in Vivian's things, something she'd written but never sent to Dad. "I think you should read this," he said quietly. "It might help you understand who she really was." The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death. In it, Vivian poured out years of resentment and jealousy, complaining that Dad had always favored me, that she'd never been appreciated despite her business success, that she'd worked harder for his approval and never received it. The letter revealed a woman consumed by bitterness and entitlement, someone who had convinced herself that stealing from her family was justified by imagined slights and perceived unfairness. Reading those words, I finally understood that the sister I'd grieved for had never really existed. Vivian had been wearing a mask for years, hiding her true nature behind carefully constructed charm and success. Dad's death hadn't changed her, it had simply revealed who she'd always been. Margaret Sullivan recovered fully and returned to work not at Dad's company, but as a volunteer helping other elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation. David Park started a consulting firm specializing in fraud detection, using his experience with Marcus to help other businesses identify and prevent embezzlement. As for me, I used part of the inheritance to establish the Robert Blackwood Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial abuse by family members. Dad would have been proud to know that his death, tragic as it was, had led